So everybody knows about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, right? God sends Moses and Aaron to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. But he also says, Pharaoh will not listen to you, in order that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go out of his land. There are many verses in Exodus that say something like this, and you read that, and it's like, wait a minute, is God making him disobey by hardening his heart? Why would he do that? Well, apparently it's so that his wonders may be multiplied. But that doesn't seem right, and a lot of people argue that God merely allowed Pharaoh to harden his own heart. And there are many verses that say Pharaoh hardened his own heart. There's also this idea that God would never violate man's free will, so when it says Yahweh hardened his heart, it must mean something else. So let's open up our Bibles and dig into this question. Does God, according to the Bible, cause people to sin? Now, I don't think most people appreciate that this heart-hardening thing is not an isolated incident. Yahweh kinda does this a lot. First, let's focus on the free will angle. There seem to be a lot of verses from the Bible where it appears that God inspires a person to make a certain choice or have certain thoughts and feelings without that person's consent. Let's look at some examples. There was not a town that made peace with the Israelites except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All were taken in battle. For it was Yahweh's doing to harden their hearts, so that they would come against Israel in battle, in order that they might be utterly destroyed, and might receive no mercy, but be exterminated, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel, for Yahweh had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that Yahweh might bring ruin on Absalom. Once Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw a Philistine woman. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw a Philistine woman at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. And he argues with his parents a bit. His father and mother did not know that this was from Yahweh, for he was seeking a pretext to act against the Philistines. At that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So in this one it appears that Yahweh makes Samson fall in love with a Philistine woman, knowing that the relationship will end in disaster and give Samson a reason to fight the Philistines so that he will ultimately liberate Israel. That is some real 4D chess. Or maybe he just arranged it so that Samson would see her, so it's more indirect. I'll give you there's some wiggle room on that one. Finally, in this one, Eli's sons are being bad, and Eli tells them to stop, and it says, But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of Yahweh to kill them. Now I think all these verses present a pretty tough case that, according to some biblical texts, Yahweh does interfere with what we would call free will. I think the most problematic are the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, the hardening of the Canaanites' hearts in Joshua, and the passage about Eli's sons, where Yahweh apparently leads people to their own destruction by causing them to sin. And although I can't read the original Hebrew, I don't think this is a translation issue. If you look at all the English translations of these verses, they pretty much all say the same thing. But this seems to contradict other biblical passages, like Ezekiel 33:11. As I live, says Lord Yahweh, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from their ways and live. But wait, Eli's sons didn't turn from their wicked ways because it was the will of Yahweh to kill them. And I don't think you can say here that he was merely allowing them not to listen to their father, or surely it would be the other way around. It wouldn't say that they didn't listen, for it was the will of Yahweh to kill them. It would say it was the will of Yahweh to kill them, for they didn't listen. So how do we reconcile this? Well, we could always say that Ezekiel and the author of Samuel are two different people with differing views on theology and ethics expressed in their works, right? No, Eccentriastes, you fool! Don't you even know that St. Bigus Dickus in the 3rd century proved these texts are totally compatible? Yeah, feel free to tell me about it, but I'm not optimistic that his explanation is going to be as parsimonious as mine. So moving away from issues of direct interference with people's minds, I want to look at more indirect cases, because this pattern of causing people to sin and then punishing them for it also appears in Isaiah chapter 6. This is Isaiah's prophetic commission, where he first takes on the role of a prophet. And what exactly is God sending him to do? Let's see. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, Keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull, and stop their ears, and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and comprehend with their minds, and turn and be healed. Then I said, How long, O Lord? And he said, Until cities lie waste, without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until Yahweh sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. Even if a 10th part remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains standing when it is felled. Okay, now I'm aware that the Bible can be a very subtle, enigmatic, unclear book, but the meaning of this passage, I don't know how it could be any clearer that the purpose of Isaiah preaching, and he is going to tell people to be righteous and all that, but the purpose of that preaching and prophesying is in effect to harden their hearts, so that they will not turn from their ways, and Yahweh will ultimately punish them and kill a lot of them. That is Isaiah's mission from God, as it is explicitly spelled out here. And if God is sending Isaiah to preach to the people, not in order to redeem them, but in order to make them more recalcitrant, then isn't it fair to say that God is causing the Israelites to sin here? Also, let's talk about the kings of Israel. So in Samuel and Kings, there's this weird issue where God keeps choosing bad kings. And by bad kings, I mean kings that cause Israel to sin, which he then has to punish them for, of course. At least for southern Israel, you could say he didn't have a choice because he made a promise to David to preserve his dynasty, but in northern Israel, they go through several dynasties appointed by God explicitly or implicitly, and all consisting solely of evil kings who cause the people to worship idols. And this divine selection is very explicit in the case of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who becomes the archetypal bad king. He sets a terrible precedent by the Bible's standards for all future Israelite kings. So, what's going on? Are we going to act like Yahweh's not responsible for this? I mean, if one of these kings appointed a governor, knowing that he was malicious, and that governor did something bad, wouldn't the king be responsible? And isn't Yahweh responsible for appointing Jeroboam and thereby causing Israel to sin? Then again, if we read this in light of Isaiah 6, maybe that was the point. Yahweh was against the idea of Israel having kings in the first place, but he let them do it anyway, which, if you know how Yahweh usually disciplines Israel, should raise a red flag. So maybe he intentionally gave them evil kings as a punishment, which made the people more evil, which required more punishment. Sort of like when you catch your kid smoking a cigarette, so you start buying him cigarettes and encouraging him to smoke for decades until he gets cancer. That'll teach him a lesson. But I'm just speculating there. The dynamic in all of these examples we've covered seems to be something like this. Yahweh has a desire to inflict punishment, but because he's just and patient and all that, he can't punish people more than they deserve. But this leads to the perverse result of him causing people to act worse so that he can inflict a worse punishment. But that doesn't seem right. Even if you can argue that the punishments are indeed deserved, that just doesn't seem like a very benevolent way of acting. Wouldn't it be equally just, if not more, to take actions that are likely to result in correcting people's behavior rather than worsening it? Well, I think to answer that question, we have to turn to the New Testament, Romans chapter 9. What then are we to say? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who shows mercy. For the Scripture says to Pharaoh, I have raised you up for the very purpose of showing my power in you, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he chooses, and he hardens the heart of whomever he chooses. You will say to me then, why then does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who indeed are you, a human being, to argue with God? Will what is molded say to the one who molds it, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one object for special use and another for ordinary use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience the objects of wrath that are made for destruction? And what if he has done so in order to make known the riches of his glory for the objects of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? Yes, Paul unironically uses the "who are you to argue with God" argument. But more importantly, this states explicitly what was implied in our Old Testament readings and seems to take it to the ultimate extreme. When people are made, God preordains them for either destruction or glory. Accordingly, God has mercy on whoever he wants and hardens the heart of whoever he wants. One's actions are not chosen independently of God's will, rather he determines them and then blames you for them, justly, of course. And the reason is to show his power and make known his glory to those who he has compassion on. And as awful as all of that sounds, there are Christians who agree with this interpretation, namely Calvinists. And I think they've got a point. Paul does really sound like a Calvinist here. Of course, there are also many other interpretations, but I feel like I've done enough for one video, but I encourage you to tell me about them in the comments. So in conclusion, it seems God does not cause people to sin, because God doesn't exist. But, this has all been food for thought.